We have an extremely special guest to me, and I hope to you, and that is Callie Wright. She is an activist, speaker, and host of the Atheist Manifesto podcast, which explores the intersection of the atheist movement and the LGBTQ rights movement. And I have to say that it's my favorite podcast, hands down. I have learned so much from Callie. Her ability to educate with love and humanity is unparalleled. I can't think of any other podcast that I've listened to that is so warm and human. I can't go on enough. Let's see, just a couple of facts. 2017 annual homeless assessment report to Congress, 40,000 plus unaccompanied homeless youth and transgender youth account for at least 2% of that. And I also know that atheist youth account for some percent of that because we get letters all the time from kids who say, I came out to my parents and they kicked me out of the house. So it's being non-normative. It's hard for parents to deal with sometimes. And we want to talk about how you can do better. I've learned a lot from Callie, and I've learned stuff from Kendall and Mandisa too. We're going to talk about this right head on. One more thing, a couple more things actually, about how hard it is to be trans. The articles are easy to find about people being hurt and even killed just because they're transgender people. And the Salvation Army puts a gag order on its employees so they don't talk about LGBTQ issues. What are they, invisible? They're trying to make them invisible, and I want to fight back at that. And that is why I have Callie on, because she said, what are you going to do? And I was like, well, I'm going to do what I can, and here we are. One more thing. Sorry, I'm going to keep interrupting with marvelous things. If you don't have this issue of National Geographic, get it. It is cover to cover about the gender revolution. It talks about the science behind the various and sundry things that people are unfortunately having such a hard time coming to grips with. I have lent that out to so many people. It is dog-eared and it has my address label on it, so it comes back to me, but they all read it cover to cover. It's an excellent magazine. If you don't understand the issue, that will explain damn near everything about it. Okay, I'm going to shut up and get to the important folks. So, how is everybody doing today? I'm going to go screen right to left and start with Kendall. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, thanks. How are you?
I am okay. I am above ground, and that's good.
Good.
Right. And Callie, how are you doing?
I am highly caffeinated at the moment.
Maybe that's my problem. Maybe I haven't had enough. Oh my gosh. Mandisa, are you there? Mandisa? Oh, she's still in progress to getting to where she can be.
Car problems, I think.
Yeah, dealing with car problems. Yep, that's an excused absence in our book. Okay, so where do you want to start, Callie? I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, I mean, I try really hard not to have super strong opinions about certain things in parenting because I'm not a parent, right? And I've seen enough of my friends dealing with parenting to understand that it's difficult on a level that you probably can't understand unless you are a parent.
Yep.
But like, obviously I've had parents, I'm a person who has parents, and I'm a person who's spoken a lot with people about their relationships with their parents and what's been helpful and what's been not. And with certain members of my family, I've been kind of on the receiving end of both of those things. My mom is just the most amazing person in the world. I love her to death. And, any struggles that she had with me being trans were all framed as like, well, this is just something that I have to figure out, and I might just need your help along the way. Whereas I had, my grandma and my aunt who, my grandma made sort of a middling effort and my aunt just outright refused. And then, I deal with support groups. I helped facilitate a few sessions of a trans youth support group. And the group was actually made up of younger kids, so like ages like 6 to 12. And like just talking to those kids, because they're far more self-aware than most people give kids credit for being. And I think that's a universal thing. But I think more so with queer and trans and gender nonconforming youth, because, just generally speaking, we're kind of forced to examine ourselves a little more than the quote unquote average person. Like, I hate using terms like that, but like, I'm sure you get what I mean when I say that. And so I've seen a very wide spectrum of like things that are very helpful for parents to do, things that are very not helpful for parents to do, and certain issues of like time and place when it comes to the things that parents do in their journey with their queer and trans youth. And so, when you invited me on, actually my initial thought was like, I don't know that it makes sense for me to come on the show because I don't have kids, right? It's about parenting, but like I have perspective as a person who has been parented.
That's what I wanted. That's what I wanted. That's infinitely more valuable. It is. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I guess to just sort of start things off, I mean, I believe the statistic is that a youth is 8 times less likely to attempt suicide if they have an accepting family behind them. In my experience, kids are generally pretty resilient as long as they know they have a core group of people who have their backs. And so that doesn't mean that bullying doesn't suck. And that doesn't mean that getting made fun of by your peers doesn't suck. But you have a little bit of a softer place to land. And so I think a lot of times people underestimate the value of that, I think. And like just knowing that your parents have your back. And I also think that a lot of times parents get caught up in like, what do I need to know? What do I need to know? What do I need to know? And like, obviously, depending on the age of your kid, to one level or another, this is a thing your kids had a lot of time to think about. And so like, I think a lot of times what gets missed is like, why don't you just ask your kid? You just have the conversation, right? Because if they don't know, they probably know the questions that you can help them find answers to. And so I think there's sort of an obsession about like information gathering, and I have to understand this to learn how to deal with it. And, my message is generally like, we shouldn't predicate acceptance upon our understanding. And I think not a lot of people actually feel that way, but it's sort of the implication of the way the conversation goes. But I also think we just have to kind of get comfortable with the fact that like if you're not trans, there's a level at which you're never going to understand what it's like, and that's okay. You don't have to in order to accept your kid and to try to understand where your kid's coming from. And that's not to say that you shouldn't try to understand and ask questions and try to learn. Like obviously we should always do that. But I think in some of my conversations with folks that I've heard, there's just this obsession of like, I have to understand this to know how to deal with it. And I just don't think that's true.
I want to put that on a gold plate. The acceptance is not predicated on understanding. That is so freaking brilliant. And as parents talking about parenting, we talk about that all the time. If your kid is having a tantrum, you don't need to understand why. Your kid just needs you. Your kid needs that soft place to fall. And it goes the same here. You don't have to understand it. You just need to be there for them. Be that parent. Be that safety net. Right on.
Yeah. And that's sort of the other thing that I see a lot of times, and I want to be careful how to frame this because it can come across as saying that like you're not allowed to have your own feelings, especially about your kid being trans, about your kid being queer. That's kind of a different thing because that literally has really nothing to do with you. But being trans obviously does, because you're talking about possibly using a different name, using different pronouns, and it kind of, depending on the kid's particular situation, maybe upending your life and changing your life completely around. So, but there's obviously people are allowed to have their feelings, but I think what I see a lot of times is parents centering themselves in the conversation. And so I've gone to a couple of support group meetings that were centered around parents of queer and trans youth. And the idea is for me to talk as a trans adult to these parents of trans kids And, you know, just like, here's what my experience has been, here's what I've been through. And like at the end of the day, I am a relatively happy, well-adjusted adult and I'm okay. And so it's sort of to reassure these folks that like, yes, your kids can be okay. And I think that's an important conversation to have. But I've also, in some of those meetings, I've seen where parents will bring their kids to the meeting and then spend like 30 or 45 minutes talking about how difficult their trans kid has made their life.
Oh God.
And so again, time and place, right?
Right.
You're allowed to have your feelings, whatever struggles you're having, that's okay. And it makes sense to talk to other people who are in that same position to build that sense of community. But you don't want to spend an hour in front of your kid talking about how difficult your kids made your life.
Never.
And that's a thing that I see that could use that could use some changing.
Absolutely. Kendall, did you want to chime in?
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say I can definitely relate to that just as a queer person. Every conversation I've ever had with my parents was revolved around, you know, like what are we gonna tell our friends? Well, you know, what, you're gonna bring a wife home to see grandma and grandpa someday? And it's like, well, what, you're not even concerned about whether or not I'm going to be happy.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, again, it's centering yourself. It's, you know, what is this going to do for my reputation? What does this make me look like?
Yeah.
And, you know, thankfully, my mom was, you know, she was like, well, we'll figure it out. And one of the best things that my mom ever said to me was, you know, I was talking about my more conservative family members. And this was in the very, very initial stages of me coming out. Like I had come out to a couple of my friends and her at this point, and I was really worried about my grandma and my aunt in particular, the two folks that I don't have a relationship with anymore. And my mom was like, well, you know, we'll work it out. We'll have the conversation. But like, if you're not welcome in that house, neither am I.
Well, yeah, you go, Mom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is so amazing.
Yeah. A lot of people will say they would do anything for their kid, and I don't see how this is any different. If my child wanted, I don't care what it is, I would do what I could to facilitate that. And it's, why do you think it is that this is different? Yeah,
and you know, there's so many different answers to that question, and I think that's part of what makes it so difficult is because, you know, anti-trans bigotry is, I mean, a lot of people boil it down and make it sound very simple, and I don't. In some ways it is, in some ways it's not, right? Because we have very strict gender roles and gender stereotypes that are, you know, we can sort of trace their roots back to patriarchal religion, but I don't think that's the only place these things exist, right? And even if we point back to those things as being the source, those things exist outside of patriarchal religion now too. Like we've seen how horribly toxic some atheist spaces have gotten now. So like a lot of people like, oh, well, like I'm going to blame, you know, conservative Christianity for it. And like that, sure, that exists. And the people in power who are like leading the fight against us and trying to get bad laws passed are definitely leading with their Bible. So it's not to say that's not an important part of the conversation to have, but I think we do ourselves a disservice if we just pin everything on that. And, you know, really just ask like why do you have a problem with this? And I think a lot of times it comes back to like what Kendall was saying earlier. Even if someone doesn't necessarily have a problem with it themselves, they know that other people do, and so it becomes a thing about like oh, how is this going to affect my reputation? What's this going to make me look like? Because I know this isn't okay with other people. It's weird and it's exotic, and that's and just by virtue of it being weird and exotic, that makes it not okay.
The whole, I think from what I can tell, and correct me if I'm wrong, all of the worst things come from a place of toxic masculinity.
I would agree.
The dangerous things. And what the hell? Why do they care so much?
Yeah, well, I mean, it just has to do with the idea of, you know, like, it's a terrible thing to be a woman, right? So like why, and this is horribly reckless framing, but you're going to understand what I'm saying. Why would a man want to be a woman? You know what I mean? Because that's the worst thing you can be. And it's rooted in homophobia too. Like, you know, like, because people see me as a man being queer. And so like, what else, what worse could you be than gay and a woman? You know what I mean? And so, right. And I think that has a lot to do with the attitude. And I think, you know, our society builds people's self-esteem on where they fit into these gender roles, right? Like, you're a man's man, you're tough and you're masculine and you like fly American flags and smoke cigarettes and drink beer and like you're manly man, you know? And I am someone who from the outside seems to be someone who like, I don't want any part of that. I'm not, you know, it doesn't fit with me at all. And I think, and this is like, this comes dangerously close to claiming that I know what's going on in someone else's head. So like, I can't make this as a blanket assertion that I know this to be true. It's the sense that I get is that people have some innate sense that those things are built on shaky ground. Right, that those are things that society have made up. They don't really have any basis in reality, and but they've built their sense of self upon those things. And someone like me is a very visceral representation of the fact that those things are not fixed, and that you know, like if I've built my entire sense of self and my entire sense of pride on being a man, and I look at somebody else that I see as a man who is like, yeah, I don't want any part of that, then like that diminishes manhood in some way, and it feels threatening. And then the other side of it, to bring homophobia back into the conversation, is, and this is what ends up getting a lot of trans women murdered, is that you know, a straight guy finds himself attracted to a woman and then finds out she's trans, and then he thinks that makes him gay. And because he's been taught that gay is one of the worst things you could possibly be, rage and violence ensues.
Yeah, I think in addition to that, you know, fear is driven by the unknown. And I think that people really just aren't educated about like any of this stuff about sexuality and gender identity and how they don't necessarily, you know, correlate with each other. Like I've been asked before when I told someone I was a lesbian, oh, so do you want to become a man someday? And I'm like, what? Where did you get this? No. So there is such a big misunderstanding going on in our society.
Yeah. Oh my God. What?
I know.
And the whole ideology as persona thing gets people in trouble in a million ways.